A number of years ago, there was a TV show that started airing, and I found a great source of entertainment for me. This show is called Fool Us, and it's hosted by the two great magicians, Penn and Teller. And the premise is very simple. Penn and Teller are sitting there, and they have all sorts of contestants trying to fool them, trying to outdeceive them, trying to do tricks in such a way that they've never seen before and cannot guess how it's done. And if they stump them, if they fool them, they win. It's all about that game of deception. And we're pretty familiar with the game of deception, whether it's in magic or outside of magic. Certainly, we know that many times human beings do struggle to tell the truth, and that fibs are quite commonplace. But there's one deception that threatens all the rest. It's a great deception, a deception that leads many people astray. This deception is joy. Now, I'm not speaking of the joy that came to your mind right then, but I'm speaking about all of the false joys, all of the things that threaten the real joy that comes to us in Jesus Christ, all of the things that get in the way of a relationship and what He offers to us. Are we aware of the difference? And what do we do about it as we celebrate this third Sunday of Advent? Because the season's all about preparation, and preparation for great joy. The first reading came from the book of the prophet Isaiah, as has been the case the last couple of weeks. And it, again, emphasizes this point that someone great is coming. And so we start with very vivid and beautiful imagery. That we're told about how the desert and the parched land will all of a sudden receive something. Even the steppe itself will also bloom. And so we see that it goes from very stark nothingness to an abundance of great things and a lot of beauty. And then it continues on, that the glory of all so many places will also be the glory of those that hear this good news. And then there's a proclamation to be not afraid, to be strong and to take heart. Here comes your God. He comes with vindication. This is the heart of the messianic prophecy that is in this particular passage. And so it continues on. And it says that whenever the Lord is in their midst, what's going to happen? The blind will be able to see, the deaf hear, the mute speak, the lame will leap like a stag, we're told. So many great things. And so there will be no longer no need for sadness nor mourning, and there will be great joy, as we're told, when the Messiah appears, as Isaiah sees it. And the response of the people would have naturally been what we heard in the responsorial psalm: Lord, come and save us. We want to see this great joy, this tremendous marvel, this one who's going to set us free. Then we move on to the gospel, and we hear Jesus encountering the disciples of John. At this particular moment, John is in prison because he spoke out against the leadership of the time and the way that they were living in sin and vice. But he hears about Jesus. He hears about this one who's working great works. And so he sends his disciples over to ask this question: are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? And he answers in kind of an abstract way, or at least it seems so on the surface. He says, go back and tell John what you see, that the blind are able to see, the deaf are able to hear, that the mute speak, that the lame are leaping like a stag, and that lepers are cleansed, and the dead are raised to life. This might seem like he's just listing off accomplishments, but in fact, he's saying something in a language that John would understand. That he's actually pointing back to the very reading we heard from Isaiah and saying all of these things that were said would happen when the Messiah appeared are indeed happening. And so, in effect, what his answer to John the Baptist is yes, I am the one who is coming. And so the disciples, they start to return back. We can imagine that the crowds are watching as the disciples disappear into the distance, and Jesus, he starts to speak to the crowds about John. He said, what did you go out into the desert to see? A reed swayed by the wind. Someone dressed in great garments. And he goes into this to lay out before them that as great as John the Baptist is, there is someone still greater. And it's an unexpected someone. that he says it's not necessarily a person that is living, but he says the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John. He doesn't want them to get distracted by the example of John, nor by his greatness, as great as he was and as important as his task was. He doesn't want them becoming despondent or saying that greatness is only for John the Baptist. He says, if you make it to the kingdom of heaven, you will be greater than John the Baptist is now. And that too is a great message, because he doesn't want them getting distracted, but he wants them ultimately clinging to the one who is there before them, that relationship with Jesus, that's important, and then it's going to lead them to a place of great joy, which is the kingdom of heaven, and that will be where they experience true greatness. So what does all this mean? Well, I would start with this question, and it's a question that might seem rather odd, but it's a question that is worth answering. Are you experiencing joy right here and right now? Are you experiencing joy? Now, that might seem odd because we might think to ourselves, well, I experience joy here and there. I've got this thing going right or that thing. But no, we need to understand what kind of joy I'm asking about, because there are all sorts of joys and apparent joys in this life. That there are the joys that are true and authentic, yes. But then there are some things that try to take the place of joy. And then there are some things that steal away joy completely, even though they try to make us think that they are joy. Let's start first with those. The things that try to make us think that they are joys, but in fact steal joy away. These are nothing other than sins. These are the things where we wrong our Lord and we wrong our neighbor, we even wrong ourselves. That these are the things that promise us temporary rejoicing or happiness in some way, but in fact leave us wanting or in a worse place than we were before. These are the things that are false joys. And we know sins, and we could go through those all day long, but there's a few categories we could pay attention to just to get the idea. The sins of the flesh, for example. That these are the obvious pleasures of this life, and they might give us some sort of semblance of power, at least for a moment, but they enslave us. They, in fact, make us slaves to our baser passions, and we, in fact, find ourselves in a worse place than when we were before. There's so many of these. Or maybe it's the sins of the tongue. Maybe we find ourselves struggling with gossip. Maybe negativity. Maybe we find ourselves slandering our brothers and sisters. There's so many options for that as well. That as good as the tongue can be, it can also be a source of wickedness. And even though we might speak those words just to feel like we belong, or to give us some sense of happiness or control, it in fact loses control and gives us no happiness. Or then there's the sins that are not spoken, the sins of the heart. The sins that tell us that it is okay to wish that person evil. It is okay for us to hold on to grudges. It is okay for us to do all sorts of things, even to wish evil things to happen, or to rejoice whenever they do happen to a person we don't like. These are the sins of the heart. And there's so many other sins that we could enumerate against our Lord, against the church, against our duties and the precepts of the church as well. Or maybe it's even relationships. That sometimes there are relationships that crop up in our lives that are less than good, that actually lead us further from the gospel. And in fact, even as fleeting a joy they may promise, they actually hurt us and do us harm. There's a great many things. They seem to present themselves as joy, but they're deceptive. They aren't, and they steal away our joy. Or maybe there's the things that are kind of in the middle. The things that can produce good joy, but also have to be put into their right place. And so we're talking priorities here. For example, we have relationships in our life that are important and are good and are life-giving. But if they dethrone God from being first priority in our life, then they are not good, and they become disordered. And so whether that's family, whether that's friends, whatever relationship it might be, that God always has to take first place. No other relationship can take that. And so we have to have it rightly ordered in our life. Otherwise, it can start to veer us off away from the Lord. Or even money and possessions. Great things in their own right in some way. But they can also start to veer us off from the Lord. And so we have to rightly order it for the good and for our God. Otherwise, it too can steal us away. Or maybe even the sources of entertainment that we continue to consume. Now, it doesn't have to be a TV show. It could be sports. We know how pervasive sports are in our day and in our age. And it's so much that oftentimes we have to wonder, what is the level of priority in our life? That sometimes we even find that if we actually stack things up, if we calculate it, it takes far more time and far more effort than we ever put into our relationship with God. That we need to be aware of that. That's a form of idolatry. And it doesn't have to be that way. We could enjoy it in its right order, but it has to put us closer to God and not steal away time and effort and energy that is due to Him. These and so many other things, they are goods, but they have to order us to God, or they become less than good, even as they might produce some sort of joy in our life. If the joy does not lead us closer to God, it is not going to lead us to good places. And that is why we have to move back to the joys that are of God, a relationship with God, making Him take first place in our lives, actually giving Him priority, the energy, and the time that He deserves. And if we recognize in our life that there are those joys, the false joys that are in our life, we actually renounce those things. And we go to confession. We don't make excuses for why we do these things. That the Lord doesn't want our excuses, and the excuses, they block off a life of grace. We renounce those distractions. We renounce those excuses. That we go through the door of the confession, we experience God's mercy. And we don't tell ourselves that everyone else is doing it. That's not going to help us in the end. And we also don't tell ourselves that we can quit whenever we want. Today's the day. Today's the joy to put aside those false joys and to really cling tightly to the only one and the only thing that can give us true joy. And that is a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the promise of the joys of the kingdom of heaven. Because we may not experience directly where we see that the blind are able to see, the deaf are able to hear, the mute speak, and so many of the other things. But we do know one thing, that if we follow a life of Christ, the life that Christ would have us live, if we follow faithfully to the very end, the dead will be raised to life. Not in this life, but in the life to come, in the kingdom of heaven. And we can experience that joy of the new Zion, of the new Jerusalem, of being in the presence of our Lord and our God forever. The TV show Fool Us by Penn and Teller, it shows us deception and how oftentimes it's easy to uncover and sometimes a little more difficult. And that's why it's important for us to focus on this third Sunday of Advent on the theme of joy, so that we renounce those joys that are inauthentic, that are false, and lead us further away from our God, so that we can cling tightly to the things that bring us closer to the kingdom of heaven and to Jesus Christ Himself. My brothers and sisters, during this third week of Advent, are we joyful? Are we experiencing great joys? What does cause us joy? And is it what God would want to cause us joy? Let's consider that and pray with that so that we can make room for the joys that never cease, that never fade away, that are our Lord and our God, and the promise of the kingdom of heaven.